Hi, this is Jason Salemi. I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the University of South Florida College of Public Health. And tonight I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about reporting on COVID-19 deaths, specifically in Florida. As you can imagine, and rightfully so, there's been a lot of attention in the media and by researchers on COVID-19 deaths. But there's a lot of misunderstanding going on out there as to what the information means on COVID-19 deaths, depending on what data source you get it from. And I'm here to say I completely understand it is challenging, but I'm going to try and take a few minutes and hopefully make it a little bit more clear as to what you're looking at and what you need to pay attention to. Now, full disclosure, my friend and colleague Olivier Lacan already put together a YouTube video last night on this exact topic. He goes through a lot of actually getting the data and incorporating it into his graph, and he covers a few of the things that I'm going to talk about. I wanted to take information that came out today and basically add as a supplement to what he's already provided to you. So you can either use this video as a one-stop shop, or I would certainly encourage you to watch his video, watch this video, and I think between the both of them, you'll have a really good understanding of what's going on. Okay, so if you would go to the New York Times page for Florida, this is what you'd find in terms of their, temporal trends in the number of deaths per day, right? Each bar in this graph is a different date, and the height of the bar is the number of deaths. And so on July 11th, they reported 95 new deaths in Florida. And this is the COVID tracking project. Again, very similar shape to this graph. The other thing that you'll notice is they report 98 new deaths, a little bit of a discrepancy, but I want you to notice a pattern here. So in both of these graphs, you kind of tend to notice some bars that are higher up, and then you see some valleys that are usually 2 bars in length. So 2 dates, 3 days in length. And so you notice that about both of these. So I'm going to come back to that. But both of these groups, when they report their information, it's based on the date that the death was reported. So if a person died 2 weeks ago and it was reported today, they're going to report that death today. Why is that? Well, when they're looking at the information that the Florida Department of Health makes available on their dashboard on a daily basis, let's say yesterday they reported 600 deaths and today they reported 650. That's 50 new deaths. So they take 650 minus 600 and they come up with this is the number of new deaths reported on this day. Okay. And again, there are a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into that they do it this way. It's the easiest without having access to much more granular data is essentially the answer. Why is there a difference between the 98 and the 95? My guess is that maybe the New York Times is only reporting on deaths to Florida residents. That's what the Florida dashboard used to provide. And maybe the COVID tracking project is actually reporting on both resident and non-resident deaths. There could be another reason. I'm just speculating here. But again, the important thing is both of these are focused on death reporting based on the date that the death was actually reported, not when it occurred. So if we look at the official website from the Florida Department of Health, they actually give, a sequence of deaths over time. And, again, each bar corresponds to 1 day. And this is based on the date that the death actually occurred. This is kind of for me, and again, all of these data metrics can be important for different things. This is my gold standard. This is what I want to know. I want to know when a person died. I want the date to be reported on that day, right? And so the problem is they only report it for the past month or so. And so this will constantly keep shifting forward in time. So you can't get a good look at the totality of information since early March, let's say. But again, this information is based on death reporting based on the date that the death actually occurred. And last but not least, if you look at the community coronavirus website, they have a visualization based on deaths, but this is yet a third example. This is based on the date that the case was confirmed, right? So you'll notice that the graph on the right doesn't look like the graph on the left for a couple of reasons, 2 main reasons. One is that the community coronavirus dashboard actually does give you the entire scope from the beginning of March through today's date, or at least through yesterday's date on which today's reporting is based. But you'll even notice towards the right side, the bars just don't line up. Again, it's because it's just different, right? So if a person died today, in this data set, I would not report that death today. I would report it on the day that the person tested positive. You might ask, well, why would you do that? Well, in the individual data download that actually has information on each case, the only information that they actually provide to you is the date that the case was confirmed, which is usually the date that the person tested positive. They also give you another date that could be the date of symptom onset for people who had symptoms, but they don't give you the date of death even if a person died. They only tell you, did they die, yes or no. So we've got three different scenarios: reporting on deaths based on date that the death was reported, based on the date that the death occurred, and based on the date that the case was confirmed among cases who died. So let me walk you through a visualization that's kind of crude, but hopefully it helps you to understand the difference between all of these dates. So let's say a person is exposed to the virus on June 1st. They start to develop signs and symptoms after the latent period is over. They're probably infectious at this point in time, but it's 5 days later. It's on June 6th that they're actually developing signs and symptoms. And let's say they sit on it for a couple of days, the symptoms and signs are starting to get a lot worse, and so they end up going to the emergency department. They get tested there on June 9th, so this is 8 days after they were exposed to the virus. 3 days after they develop signs and symptoms. And let's say in an ideal world, those test results, boom, are sent up to the Department of Health, and that person would be listed as a confirmed case as of June 9th. Let's then say this person gets worse and they're hospitalized a day later. So they were in the emergency department, they spent the night there, and then they're hospitalized the next day on June 10th. This person unfortunately ends up dying from complications due to COVID-19, but that death doesn't actually occur until June 24th. And because there is a lag in reporting, that can be way more than 1 week, but let's say in this case, it was 6 days after the death occurred that the death was reported to the Department of Health, and they made it actually available on their website. So again, just looking at the various dates that we have here, this is the date that the death would have been reported, would have appeared on the Florida Department of Health's dashboard. So that New York Times, the COVID tracking project, this is when we would have seen it. On June 30th, this is where that date would have been assigned, the death would have been assigned. This is the date that the case was confirmed. So if you look at the community coronavirus dashboard, that visualization that I showed you based on date that the case was confirmed, this is when that death would actually be assigned. This is the date to which it would be assigned. And of course, the Department of Health's official website reports based on the date that the death actually occurred. So again, this is the difference in when those dates, would have lined up, and there's a couple weeks difference between the earliest and the latest of these dates. Okay, so again, date that the death occurred is this green arrow here. Date that the death would have been reported to the Department of Health and tracked on their dashboard is right here. And if you're reporting based on for people who died based on the date that they became a case, it's over here. So again, wide variability. And again, I just want to show you, this is actually the publicly available downloaded data set. This is actually from today. There are a lot more records in it, obviously, than I'm showing you here, but this is just a snapshot. And so again, what you get is this case date and the chart date are pretty much the same thing, but the case date tells you when the person tested positive and was confirmed as a case by the Florida Department of Health. The event date in column O is basically telling you the date of symptom onset for those people who develop symptoms. And if they didn't develop symptoms, they probably are going to put the same date that falls in column N, which is the date that they became confirmed as a case. Okay. So let's shed some further light on this. So this is now going to be a hypothetical example, right? So let's say there were 50 new deaths reported on July 11th, yesterday, right? But these deaths didn't all occur on July 11th. This is how they're actually distributed. If we took those 50 and said, well, we knew about them yesterday, but when did these people actually die? Let's say this is the distribution, right? So anywhere from July 1st to July 11th, that's the number of deaths on each of those days from the 50 that were reported yesterday. So let's just say this is the running total of deaths for those days. So we had already known about 100 people who died on July 1st. Now we're finding out yesterday on 5 additional people who happened to die on July 1st, and so on for all of these other dates. So all we do is for each day we add these two together, and now the far right column tells us, based on the best information we have right now on July 11th, this is the total number of people who died on July 1st, who died on July 2nd, and so on. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So as you can imagine, the next day comes along. So now we're on July 12th, and we had 55 new deaths reported. Again, this is not deaths that occurred on July 12th. They're deaths that we found out about on July 12th. And so again, this is the way that those 55 new deaths are distributed by day. And so there's 5 pretty much on every day. Of course, since it's July 12th, we do have a few people that were reported, like we found out they actually died on July 12th, and we found out on July 12th. That's rare, I would say, but that's going to happen. So we're adding July 12th as a new date. And again, this is just the number of new people that we just found out about who died, and this is when they died. We would now add those new numbers to the running total that we had from July 11th. And this is, again, now on July 12th, this is now our new best guess of how many people died on July 1st, 2nd, and so on. So again, the important take home here is on July 11th, my best guess estimate of how many people died on July 1st was 105. But with new information that just came in on July 12th, I'm updating my information on July 1st and all subsequent days. So that's why that chart that you see on the Department of Health's website based on date of death, that can change on a daily basis. And this is going to be really important for interpreting the latter end of that curve. So I'll close with that. Okay, so I've put up now on my dashboard a comparison of a couple of these things. So what you're looking at on the top side, and again, this visualization actually does go all together, so you can look at these two graphs together. On the top, what you're looking at is COVID-19 deaths based on the actual date that the death occurred, right? So this is similar to the official Florida Department of Health's visualization, but this is for the entire time window, right? Now, I want you to compare that to what you might have seen on like the New York Times based on the date that the death was reported. So again, you can just clearly see that, there's massive differences in, the numbers on each day and the kind of ebb and flow of both of these graphs. You wouldn't necessarily expect, the deaths on, 2 days to go down quite dramatically and then up and then down and up. You'd imagine there'd be a normal ebb and flow that's kind of consistent across time. So what I've done in the bottom one, again, that's based on the date that the death was reported. What I've done is I've colored in orange specific days. What days do you think those are? Those are weekends. So maybe the fact that we get those valleys on those 2 days in particular is because it's the weekend and reporting is slower. It doesn't tend to come in as much on the weekend as it then does on the weekdays. And so again, if you look at the far right of the graph on the bottom, you see that big peak that everybody was kind of flipping out about and saying, oh my God, we had 120 deaths on July, 8th? No, we didn't have 120 deaths that occurred on July 8th. We had 120 deaths that were reported on July 8th, but those deaths occurred on July 8th and many, many days before July 8th. So if we now compare, again, the top is the same thing based on the date that the death occurred. The bottom one is what you might see on the community coronavirus dashboard page. So it's based on the date that the case was confirmed. And again, the only thing I'll draw attention to is there are big differences in the shape of those, graphs, right? You see the kind of peaks and valleys. Maybe the overall trend has some kind of consistency, but they're pretty different, and it makes sense. They're saying different things. One is telling you when the cases died. The other one is among those people who died when they became a case is where it's reported. So again, just different information. Where does the information come from that I'm able to now construct a visualization for you based on when the deaths actually occurred? Well, it comes from here. It's made publicly available. It's the ArcGIS laboratory from the, library or gallery from the Florida Department of Health. And you can just query this system. And again, for any particular day, get the number of people who died on every day. So let's give you some real data that just came out. So this is as of downloaded today on July 12th, but what you download on July 12th is actually information that was reported on July 11th. So there were 45 new deaths reported by the Florida Department of Health on July 11th. But where did those, from when did those deaths come? Okay. So what I've done on the left now is I've given you a table of every day. And what I've shown you is the number of deaths that were reported on July 10th, so the previous day, and the number that were reported today. And all I want you to take home for now is there's no difference between those grand total numbers. 1481, a difference of 0 on those 2 days. And this is good because what this says is, of those 45 deaths that were reported today, none of those people actually died in March or April, which is good because that would be a hell of a lag in terms of reporting. So you can see where hopefully I'm headed with this. Let's look at May, right? So May, again, just focus on those grand totals. Based on the information I had on July 10th, it was 1,196. Based on the information I have on July 11th, it was the same number, so no difference. And again, what this says is, of the deaths that we found out about today, none of them died in May. And again, that's good. That would be a big lag. Now let's go to June. So look at the top numbers, and what you'll notice is there's a difference of 4. So what that means is, of the 45 deaths that popped up on the dashboard for the first time today and are added to the cumulative numbers, there were 4 of those people, again, reported yesterday, that actually died in June. And so I want to draw your attention to this one in particular. This is the oldest date to be updated. And so what this tells me is that this is a death that occurred 3 weeks ago that was just being reported or documented yesterday. So that's a 3-week lag. Thankfully, most of the deaths are not lagged this month, but it does happen. And then last but not least, this is July. And so obviously a lot of those 41 of the 45 deaths that were reported yesterday actually occurred at different points. So if you just look at the far right column, that's telling you basically the number of deaths that were reported yesterday and when they occurred. So there was 4 actually yesterday, and then 6 new ones on July 10th, and 2 new ones on July 9th, and so on. So the big picture here is, again, the 45 deaths that were reported today, most of them did not occur today. Most of them occurred earlier, usually within 1 to 2 weeks, but sometimes as long as 3 weeks. So the last thing I want to cover is, if you were astute and looking at my graph, you could say, but didn't your figure based on date of death, which I told you that's my gold standard, didn't that suggest that deaths are going down? And so this is that figure, right? If you looked at the far right, you're like, oh, there was 71 on the 7th, but look, now we're trending downward. That's a good thing, right? So be very cautious. Remember, the information is constantly being updated. For these more current cases, right, we don't know, a lot of the people who are dying yesterday, today, within the past week, we may not know about those deaths yet. So tomorrow, we may add some numbers to the right side of this graph. And so again, I'm drawing you back to this. Remember that 41 out of the 45 deaths that occurred and were reported today, they actually occurred on days well before today's date. So what does that mean? Is that I expect every bar that you see in that red rectangle, I expect them to go up quite dramatically. And they're not all going to go up tomorrow. I would say, based on the reporting that we receive in the next, 5 to 14 days. Each one of those days, we're going to learn about new deaths that occur within this window. And so all of these bars are going to continue to go up. How much they go up, I don't know, but they are all going to go up. So this is always going to be the case if you're looking at a curve based on the date of death. The right side is going to basically have a lot of incomplete information on people who died on those days, and those bars are always going to go up over time as we find out about those deaths at later days. So my take home is, I think the most accurate info on deaths is based on date of death. Right? If you have a death curve based on the date that it was reported, it can give you some information about the temporal sequencing of deaths and when they're actually occurring. But again, you already saw what's happening on the weekends, and it's just an imperfect picture, I would argue. And so the other thing that I'll leave you with is Nassim Miller did a nice story on July 9th, and it actually quoted me. I'm not just trying to bring up my quote. I am trying to make a point here. You can see that it says that I said that deaths usually trail cases for about a month. Okay. And I said, so if we hear about a death today, that tells us something about an outbreak that was already occurring about a month ago. So hopefully that came across here, right? Deaths are lagged in terms of reporting. And so everybody wants to focus on deaths. And I would say, don't just focus on deaths, because again, if we're trying to use that information to say, are we having an outbreak that's running wild and now we've got a lot of serious illness? Again, by the time we find out about the death and it's added, even if you have a date of death based curve, we're just adding those deaths as we find out about them. And so again, getting the true picture, we're always looking back in the rearview mirror, anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks at least. And so that's why, the hospitalizations are so important. They might be lagged based on when somebody was infected with the virus or got symptoms by a week or two, but it's not as a pronounced lag as you find with death data. So it's not very useful to assess an outbreak in a timely fashion, deaths that is. So anyway, I'm sorry, I've talked way more than I want to, but I hope that this, helps you to understand the different sources of data, how they're reporting information on deaths, why if you look at different graphs, they look different even for what you think is the same data. And again, I think it just has to do with understanding the underlying data and knowing what you're looking at. So I will continue to provide information on deaths based on the date that the death actually occurred. You can find the other information, and again, I make those visualizations as well available on mine, but the community coronavirus dashboard also has visualization of information on deaths, as does the main Florida Department of Health website. So again, thank you for your time. Hope you all have a great night.